I recently returned to El Salvador, a country that's been making headlines for some pretty bold moves. Most people probably recognize it because of its president, Nayib Bukele, and his controversial policies, like the crackdowns on gangs and building the world's largest mega prison, which I didn't get a chance to visit properly, but I did see it from the opposite volcano during the night, and it's lit up like a Christmas tree 24/7, its strip lights never dimmed. It's a wild place, and that's definitely a story for another day. But one of the most talked about things in recent years is how El Salvador became the first country in the world to make Bitcoin legal tender. Now, this whole using Bitcoin as money didn't just come from nowhere. It actually started as a grassroots movement in a sleepy, surfy beach town called El Zonte. The premise was simple. What if you could use Bitcoin in everyday life? For pupusas, coconuts, rent, surf lessons, and eventually real estate. The experiment began with just a few locals accepting Bitcoin, as well as with the help of an established expat called Peterson. And before long, this movement really started to snowball. In this video, I'm going to share my honest thoughts on the evolution of El Zonte, which is, by the way, one of my favorite beaches in the world and one of the best places to surf in the world as well. But it's also a place that is undergoing rapid and profound change. We'll cover spending and living on Bitcoin, the attitudes of Bitcoiners there, as well as gentrification, and of course, Bitcoin as legal tender. You'd think that with Bitcoin being made legal tender, everywhere in El Salvador would accept Bitcoin over the Lightning Network and hold their own keys and run a node.
Wrong.
I mean, this is Bitcoin. It's a fantastic, but also incredibly challenging and difficult new technology to understand, let alone implement. Yes, there are Bitcoin signs literally everywhere in El Zonte Bitcoin Beach, and there's Bitcoin meetups, and there's Hope House El Zonte, and there's even a Bitcoin hardware store. But when I actually tried to use Bitcoin as money for day-to-day purchases, I started to run into some surprising moments. For example, next to the Bitcoin hardware store, which of course accepts Bitcoin, there is a pupusa seller who does not accept Bitcoin in Bitcoin Beach. ¿Tienen pupusas, por favor? ¿Sí? ¿Acepta Bitcoin? ¿No tienen la aplicación? No. Pero están enfrente de él. And yet her husband does accept Bitcoin because she sells motorbikes to the hardware store who pay in Bitcoin. I met with Ronnie, a really nice guy who's the store owner of the Bitcoin hardware store, and he explained to me that the plan is eventually to get the wife set up with Bitcoin payments. But right now they just have the husband because the wife comes in and sells pupusas early in the morning when no one from the hardware store is there. This micro example seems really banal, but it just shows that Bitcoin adoption, even in Bitcoin Beach, requires some effort and some proof of work, and sometimes some hand-holding as well. There was also a lavanderia or clothes wash that I visited that does not accept Bitcoin anymore because she fell victim to a Bitcoin scam in Bitcoin Beach. My homestay, the Airbnb I stayed with, was happy to accept Bitcoin for part of the stay, but she explained to me that she also needed some cash to pay the people who were doing work on her house. So she wanted me to pay in cash. The default in El Zonte and across El Salvador is still to accept cash, not even bank accounts or anything of that nature, literal physical cash. So to get to Bitcoin is obviously quite a leap that requires some skill and some understanding. Now, I visited a coconut seller after surfing, and he was selling coconuts from the back of a truck. It was a husband and wife team. I asked the wife if I could pay in Bitcoin, and she said, no, we don't accept Bitcoin. But then the husband overheard me from the back of the truck and said, no, we do. And he pulled out his phone, opened up his, I think it was Blink wallet, which used to be called the Bitcoin Beach wallet, and he processed the payment. So again, you have one person in this team accepting Bitcoin and one person who's not aware yet they accept Bitcoin. And this also speaks to the fact that there are not that many people who are trying to spend Bitcoin even in El Zonte. We'll come to this in a little bit. Inevitably, some Bitcoin tourists think upon arrival to Bitcoin Beach, well, this isn't what I imagined or I signed up for. Like, why isn't everyone running around running a node and being a hardcore Bitcoiner, shouting, "End the Fed" and "Fiat is poison"? And to you, I'd say just, here's your reality check, mate. Like, not everyone in El Zonte is a hardcore Bitcoiner, and it's going to take years, probably a decade at least, before everyone in El Zonte is even aware that Bitcoin as a payments tool is definitely there and definitely works and isn't going to scam them. Just, lower your time preference, as they say. Yes, El Zonte is a destination where lots of places accept Bitcoin, but cash reigns as king. People know about Bitcoin, some are using it day to day, but it's certainly not the norm. One guy explained to me that, yes, of course I accept Bitcoin, I'm part of this Bitcoin beach thing, but I also cash it out right away because I need dollars to pay for my supplies and to pay in other shops.
Todavía no todos aceptan. Okay.
It was funny because he actually drove to El Tunco, which is the next beach along, to use the ATM there because he didn't even realize that there was an ATM in the hardware store. So there is a sort of like communication and sort of distribution of information challenge in El Zonte as well, because it is also grassroots, you know, it's just people interacting with people, and it's not some sort of centralized power which says you are going to adopt Bitcoin today. Now, final thing on sort of paying with Bitcoin in El Salvador, and this is a crutch of mine, there are lots of international Bitcoiners who move to Bitcoin Beach or El Salvador to spend dollars. There are, of course, lots of Bitcoiners who use Bitcoin as money and understand the importance and the ideological play of spending Bitcoin. And you can often find these Bitcoiners at the farmers markets on the weekends where they're genuinely spending sats in a circular fashion. But there are also plenty of Fiat Bitcoiners who save Bitcoin and spend Fiat, hence Fiat Bitcoiner. And yeah, they're probably my least favorite type of Bitcoiners living in El Zonte, because why would you go to all the effort of moving to El Zonte to get out your wallet and spend dollars? Makes no sense. Yeah, I guess I find it a little bit disappointing, to be honest. If you're in Bitcoin Beach, you should be spending Bitcoin. But yeah, maybe this is because the hype around Bitcoin Beach could be fading, or maybe it's a victim of its own success. Bitcoin has put this town on the world map, and it's made the term Bitcoin Beach a household name within Bitcoin families. On the one hand, the attention has brought investment, new opportunities, and money. The town is growing ridiculously fast. There are new hotels, new restaurants, towering beachfront hotel apartments, which frankly look quite out of place among these sort of nice little thatched roofs, sort of sleepier developments. But that kind of construction and that kind of development can mean jobs, tourism, and money coming in.
¿Qué están a construir aquí?
Eco Suites.
Eco Suites.
Sí, van a ser habitaciones para rentar.
Ah, sí, es nuevo entonces, ¿no?
Nuevo, sí.
¿Y habían gente que vivía aquí antes?
Sí, un predio de una familia que ha estado ahí aquí.
Se ven muy padres, ¿no? Está al lado del río y al lado del mar.
Sí.
Qué bueno.
Acceso a los dos, al río y al mar.
Pues mucho trabajo para ustedes, ¿no?
Sí.
But on the flip side, as more investors showed up, as more foreign money came in, and crucially, more and more wealthy Salvadorans returned to their town, prices skyrocketed. And the point about those El Salvadorans, by the way, is that 20 or 30 years ago, when gang violence was so high, lots of Salvadorans left to the States or other countries. And now, given that the crime rate has dropped so drastically, they're able to come back to El Zonte and to other towns in El Salvador. And that's also created the problem which we're going to address in this part of the video. When I arrived in El Zonte this year, I was struck by just how much new development was going on. Fancy hotels, smoothie bars, luxury villas are all popping up right next to shacks and tiny family-run shops. The din of HGVs and huge trucks driving past Mama Rosa's pupusa store was for me quite a striking visual and possibly audio metaphor, because yeah, you've just got like a pupusa store next to the road on which these huge 18-wheeler trucks are just shipping concrete and sand and logs. But she didn't seem to mind the noise at all, and actually she welcomed the development, so good for her.
Esto ha cambiado mucho, ¿no? Sí.
Bastante, sí.
Sí. ¿Ha cambiado para lo mejor?
Sí,
Sí. Oh, qué bueno, qué bueno.
está más poblado.
Más poblado.
Y hay más negocio, más comercio.
¿Los precios han subido un poco o? Un poco, sí. ¿Y los motos no le molestan entonces? Porque es como cada 2 minutos. ¿No? Oh, qué bueno, sí.
But concretely, this means that prices are going up. The average price per square meter has gone up by over 134% since 2020. It used to be around $34 per square meter, now it's over $80 per square meter. In some of these new beachfront developments, prices are shooting up past $1,000 per square meter. That is wild, especially when you remember that this is a small coastal town that just a few years ago was, barely on the map. That's no shade to Zonte, it's just that's what it was like. The left-leaning national newspaper that hates Bitcoin, called El Faro, used the following statistic. If you are earning minimum wage in El Salvador, which is about $300, $400 a month, then you would need 68 years of that salary to afford a basic beachfront home that now goes for north of $300,000. 68 years. That's, of course, how this left-leaning newspaper frames it. But it goes to show the scarcity of beachfront properties, and it goes to show this tremendous real estate boom that El Zonte is currently experiencing. Now, the point here is that while Bitcoin has of course helped attract investment and gave El Zonte international visibility, it has also made life harder for many of the locals who are already living there. Those who were squatting on deserted properties for decades have been forced out. I know the idea of someone squatting illegally is obviously wrong and illegal, but these people have effectively been forced out by El Salvadorans returning and by realtors coming in and looking to develop these properties. There is, of course, a social issue that is raised there, despite the fact that it was, of course, illegitimate squatting in the first place. On top of that, smaller legitimate rentals are being forced higher and higher up the hillside where rents are cheaper. That's just how the El Zonte sort of topography works, where beachfront is obviously more expensive, and the further and further you get up the hillside, the cheaper it becomes. Rents have gone up, and buying a home for the average Salvadoran in a beachfront property is, of course, now well out of the question. I talked to a few locals about it, and there's this mix of sort of hope and frustration. On the one hand, Bitcoin brought more tourists and business to the town, and many Salvadorans who had forgotten about the beach returned, and they returned with money. And on the other, many Salvadorans feel like they're being left behind or even pushed out of their own communities. Mike Peterson, the guy who helped start the Bitcoin Beach project, acknowledged sort of this tension, and he drew a comparison with surfing, which, like Bitcoin, has a tendency to gentrify places.
And when people talk about gentrification in El Zonte, I think it's important to understand that most locals, they didn't own the prime properties in the beach. Almost all of the properties were owned by wealthy Salvadorans. Mm-hmm. And so you have now a lot of those original owners coming back. Prior, it was for wealthy Salvadorans. Now it's more Bitcoiners. And you ask any local who they would prefer to be the caretaker for, 90% of them are going to say they would rather for a foreigner because they tend to pay better, they tend to treat them better. And I think it would be great for tourism. It would be great for Bitcoin because these surfers in from around the world that want this opportunity, and it'd be great for El Salvador.
Mm-hmm. You look at spots like El Tunco in El Salvador, which was to some extent gentrified by surfing, or Bali in Indonesia, or Tagazout in Morocco, even where I live in Portugal. And yeah, there is this pattern of surfing comes in, gentrification happens because of the foreign money, because of the tourists, and because of the nature of people sort of staying there for longer periods. And this brings with it winners and losers. But what's really interesting to me is that in El Salvador, it's against this phenomenal backdrop of just incredible crime statistics. Coupled with that, you have the fact that it's, of course, a paradise destination with amazing surf. And so you've got really safe place to live in paradise, and then this Bitcoin thing on top. So I think that to some extent, Bitcoin has catalyzed this gentrification process and has sort of enabled prices to go higher and higher. In a way, rather than hyper-Bitcoinization in El Zonte, you have hyper-gentrification. So, after a few weeks back in El Salvador this January, I found myself thinking, has Bitcoin profoundly changed the country, or is it now at risk of becoming another tech experiment that doesn't quite live up to the hype? Well, the reality is more complicated than a simple yes or no or a black and white answer, but we can look at the easily constituted facts, which is that Bitcoin has categorically not replaced the dollar in El Salvador. It is not everywhere, nor ubiquitous, and it is quite some way from being the go-to payment method for random things in El Salvador, like some thought it might be 4 or 5 years after the Bitcoin legal tender laws came into place. There are several places across the country where it works, and indeed it works better than using fiat, especially if you're a foreigner or a tourist coming in.
Gracias,
¿No?
Chao. Hasta luego. Chao. Gracias. Súper. Chao, que les vaya bien. ¿Y guardas los bitcoins que recibes o lo conviertes?
Lo guardo ahorita.
¿Lo guardas?
Sí.
¿Y después lo vendes? ¿Lo cambias?
Los cambio.
Sí, ok, qué bueno. Hey, está listo.
Sí.
Gracias.
On top of that, it has also created so many new opportunities. Just to point out some places that you can easily live on Bitcoin, there's of course Bitcoin Beach in Zonte, where with a bit of patience you can live fully on a Bitcoin standard. There is Bitcoin Berlin, a town that I'll cover in another video, as well as pockets of circular economies around the country. But ultimately, lots of people move to Bitcoin country for the marketing, for the business purposes, for the opportunities, and they're not necessarily moving there to spend their sats and live on a Bitcoin standard. This was quite a surprising thing for me, as I thought that you would move to Bitcoin country to use Bitcoin as money, but actually it turns out that they're moving to Bitcoin money because adopting Bitcoin as legal tender was kind of like adopting a freedom technology. And so within that came this alignment with freedom and a new lease of life, effectively. And yes, when it comes to payments, so while I walked around, I saw that it wasn't as integrated into everyday life as people had hoped. You know, I visited this shopping center in another video, or a shopping mall, and of the 24 shops that I visited, just 6 accepted Bitcoin. And that was before the legal tender laws were revoked. So yeah, the law was never really enforced, was it? Okay, what's the bottom line here? Bitcoin in El Salvador has not changed everything. It's not been this dramatic revolution. However, it's still there, still growing, and it's certainly still sparking conversation. And maybe that's enough for now. It's still somewhere that I love to visit, still somewhere that I love to go back to year on year. Is it enough to encourage you to visit? I don't know, you'll be the judge of that. But I'd be really interested to hear what you think about Bitcoin's impact in El Salvador. Has it been a game changer? Or is this an experiment that is even 4 years into it? Is it still too early to tell? Check out Plan B Network for all your Bitcoin questions. Thank you to Coin Corner for being the best Bitcoin exchange. And grab some free Bitcoin by scanning this from BitKit. BitKit is a mini lightning node in your pocket. Do what you love and save in Bitcoin. And also, this is a new sort of video essay type. Let me know what you think of it.